Welcome to EPC Conversations. Thank you very much for tuning in. And tonight I'm so excited to have a conversation with philosophy with an assistant professor of philosophy at Redeemer University in Canada, but also someone who's pursuing currently, as we speak, though by the time this airs, maybe a bit, or when you're watching might be different, might have been awarded, and we pray will be, a PhD in philosophy in the phenomenology as it's found in Soren Kierkegaard. All things which I hope will start to make more sense for those that don't understand it in the course of our conversation. But Amber Bowen, thank you very much for joining us and welcome to the program.
Thanks, David. It's great to be here.
So we decided to have this conversation around the topic of philosophy. So I thought as a launching off point, I would tell you as a parish minister some of the encounters I've had with people and their views of philosophy, and I thought we could use that just to leap into what might be helpful for folks. So one memory sticks in my mind was I was preaching one night a few years ago on 1 Corinthians, where Paul is very clearly talking at some points about philosophy and philosophers. And I said straight up at the start of the sermon, I'm going to be talking about philosophy here. And somebody came up to me after the service and said, "Oh, I was really worried when you said you were going to start talking about philosophy because it's a word I don't really understand. It's a thing I don't really pay any attention to." But they were very complimentary. They said, but fortunately, they basically said, fortunately, your sermon wasn't a complete train wreck for me, and I was able to understand parts of it. But I think that's the experience of a lot of Christians who are sitting in the pews and they're not getting to perhaps even as much time as a pastor or as an academic. They're not getting to sit and just read things about either theology or philosophy all week. Perhaps they think it's not relevant to them. So what would you say for your average Christian is the place of philosophy?
That's a really good question. Well, let me start off by giving just a really brief definition of philosophy that I think might put some pieces together for us, particularly in light of your story. So when you typically hear philosophy like this person reacted, you think, oh my goodness, it's this super abstract, complicated, logic chopping. I can't think on that level sort of discipline. But really, this is how I define philosophy. Philosophy is simply the practice of putting question marks where everyone else puts periods. So we go through life with lots of assumptions and lots of things that we just kind of take for granted. And they're sort of periods, they're sentences with periods in our lives. And philosophers, what they do is they just kind of kick up the dust and they remove that period and they put a question mark there and they start to interrogate it and they start to ask why. Why do we assume that? Should we assume that? How is that idea different from this idea? And so it's a kind of activity that everybody really does. I mean, if you're a human to a certain degree, you're a philosopher. And I know this because if you are alive today, that means that at one point you were a 3-year-old. And what is unique about 3-year-olds is that's when they start asking that incessant question, why, about everything. And they drive their parents nuts because they keep putting question marks where so obviously there's a period. I mean, nobody asks that as a question. It's just the way that it is. And so when you're just getting peppered all day long with a 3-year-old asking why, it drives you crazy. But we were born with this initial kind of wonder towards the world and a desire to know and a desire to discover and a desire to interrogate and ask. And it's something that we kind of lose as we grow up and we get disillusioned and we get cynical and then also we get busy and we start to have kind of assumptions that are formed for us and then we use those as our framework for the world and we operate just internal to that framework and we don't question it. And so for Christians, I think, particularly since we believe that we believe in the doctrine of creation. We believe that we're image bearers who indwell this created world that God has made and has called us to cultivate and to explore and to bring to fruition and do all of these sorts of generative activities in, right? It's an invitation for us to enter into the world with this wonder, with asking why, with looking attentively at the world that God created and not taking it for granted, or just assuming it's this object that we just kind of operate with in kind of assumed ways. Um, and so for Christians, I think just on the basis of the doctrine of creation and who we are, this practice of asking questions from a place of wonder is important. It's also something that we'll continue to do into eternity as well. If we think about the doctrine of new creation, it's the same thing forever. We're not just going to get to heaven and then know everything. we're going to be indwelling this new creation where we are forever going to be exploring and asking questions, and discovering more and more depth to God's created world. And so, yeah, I think it's an activity that should actually come very normal for Christians.
I was smiling pretty heavily when you were talking about 3-year-olds because my youngest are twins who are 4. And so
Yeah.
I was just with scathing clarity reliving that situation, which happens every day right now in my mind of the questions of why. But I think your point is well taken that we kind of lose that over time. Of course we do, because we're not all doing that. Maybe we could do that more. I also just think that's really interesting what you're saying about us as our created beings having a searching mind. And that perhaps continuing into eternity, because I was reminded of that text. I cannot remember where it is right now, where it speaks about these things which angels desire to look into. I think it's in Hebrews. And there's a sense there that if they are sinless, perfected beings and they long to search into things, then perhaps there's something insanely and supremely human about wanting to search and inquire. Would you think that's some getting closer to what you're talking about?
I do, yeah. Sometimes it's really just what it means to be a finite image bearer, right? We're not infinite, so we don't know everything, and we're never going to know everything. And we're not created to know everything, and that's a really good thing because we're these beings that get to just explore the plenitude of God and His world. And that's a joyful activity. I mean, I remember as a kid thinking that heaven was going to be, us sitting on clouds strumming harps, and that's super boring. I'm not exactly excited about that. But when you think about, no, this is not removing us from who we are. This is not extracting us from the world. It's actually this new creation that's a very real reality that we get to live in. And we continue to do these kinds of discoveries and creative activities that we're called to. So,
And that's amazing. I think that's you're right. It's such an exciting thought when we think of what we're going to spend forever doing, and I relate to you growing up thinking heaven is probably going to be quite boring, until I felt fleshed out my idea of heaven and the new life and the new world. But what about in terms of the here and now, and in terms of the Bible? Where, in your extensive study as a Christian and a philosopher, where do you get your sort of your jumping off point? Where do we get philosophy in the Bible? Because I'm sure a challenge that you've heard before is going, we just need the Bible. We don't need, or philosophy being set against the Bible. So how have
right.
you learned to intertwine those commitments and disciplines you have in your life?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I think is also another reason why Christians should be philosophically engaged. That doesn't mean everybody's to be a professional philosopher or that everybody needs to take on some kind of a burden to become an expert in different areas of philosophy, right? But I think just for the general person in the pew, just having an added attentiveness, and beginning to ask more questions and beginning to think in certain ways is a way of being philosophically engaged. And a benefit of that, not just the creation Imago Dei thing, but also is for the here and now, that we operate according to a lot of assumptions. And you have to operate according to assumptions. Nobody operates without basic beliefs about the world. But what's dangerous is when we don't realize that we operate according to certain beliefs. And we operate according to them without knowing them and without reflecting on those beliefs. And so what philosophy does is it causes you to kind of reflect what are these basic presuppositions that I'm working with, because one of the things that you do is you bring those with you when you read the Bible. You just always do. You never read the Bible with just kind of blank eyeballs. You always have certain ways of understanding and certain ways of categorizing and interpreting. That's just what it means to read. That's what actually enables us to read. So it's a good thing. It's not a bad thing. We don't want to try to shed assumptions. We just want to have good ones. And so being aware of the kinds of assumptions that you bring to the text is very, very important, because there can be ways that you try to shape the text according to your own assumptions. So even just awareness kind of allows you to not do that quite as heavily. The other thing that happens is when you come to the text, sometimes the text resists your assumptions. So there's this thing called the hermeneutical circle. So you bring to the text your framework, and then sometimes scripture will speak back against your framework. It will resist your framework. And then, you'll alter the framework and then kind of return to the text again. And you keep doing this spiral. Here's an example of what that might be like in modern day. So we live in a world that really likes to figure things out, that likes to have all the answers for everything. We like to have troubleshooting grids. So if I'm in this situation, I need to know what's the right thing to do here. If this error I'm seeing on my screen, this is how you fix it, kind of thing. So a lot of times we like to live our lives. A lot of times, even as Christians, this impacts how we think about living the Christian life. I'm in this situation. What is the biblically correct thing for me to do? And I want the right answer. And so we go to the pastor and we ask, what is the right answer for the situation? So we wind up creating these big troubleshooting grids for the Christian life. Well, then we go and we read the book of Proverbs. And it really messes up our troubleshooting grids, because we read in one verse, answer a fool according to his folly. And another verse, it says, don't answer a fool according to his folly. There is a way of describing in Proverbs what wisdom is, that it's not something that you just kind of capture in a grid. It's not strictly the right answers or the right information. Growing in wisdom is about becoming a certain kind of person. So that way, when you encounter different situations, you have the agility to be able to engage with different types of terrain. When you operate according to a troubleshooting grid, you're just one step away from one situation that didn't make it on that grid completely stumping you. Right? But if you are growing as a wise person, an embodiment of wisdom, then that means it doesn't matter the situation so much, because you're bringing to it wisdom. And you get wisdom not by memorizing all the right answers, but you get wisdom first and foremost in relation to Christ. So it's that way in which, I know a lot of people who want to do a Bible study of Proverbs and they want to, bring out the principles of Proverbs or whatever, and then Proverbs just kind of resists you from being able to put it in a kind of system like that. And it's saying instead, no, sit and listen and hear my words. So that would be an example of kind of that hermeneutical circle.
Yeah. So it sounds like you're saying that rather than having to be burdened or concerned with learning all the different philosophies and their theories, which none of us even have time to do anyway, there's a certain approach by valuing philosophy and becoming better at sitting with questions, reflecting on them, and letting them shape who we are in Christ. That might actually be better. And indeed, it was, but ironically, when you were talking about Proverbs, it sounded like the message of Proverbs might be the message of Socrates of you know nothing.
Yeah, very much so. Exactly. And
Yeah.
it's interesting to see then when you experience something like that. So if philosophy is, there's a professional philosopher that studies all the different theories and then constructs different theories and debates them and all those sorts of things. And it's good to learn those different theories. They can be informative and interesting, right? But I think for just the Christian in the pew, my encouragement is just to cultivate a philosophical disposition, which really is just a disposition of attentiveness, a willingness to reflect, to pay attention to things that maybe you would have glossed over, and to self-interrogate too. Why am I assuming this, or why did this jump out at me and not this? What is that saying about beliefs that lie kind of beneath my skin or in my gut that I just kind of carry around with me without even realizing it?
It's, I think, fascinating as well the extent to which you're drawing out philosophy. Good philosophy perhaps can't be separated from self awareness,
Mhm.
and it's overlapping perhaps in the discipline of psychology. And I'd like to get onto Kierkegaard later, but perhaps the best example ever of that these things aren't entirely separate disciplines. But that if we perhaps there's would you say it's perhaps an inattentiveness to being a fully developed Christian not to have awareness of our beliefs and assumptions, and could that actually be in the contrawise quite dangerous?
Mhm. Yeah. Well, I mean, this is actually where Kierkegaard is really strong, because that was something that he was very concerned about. Is actually that in his era, so 19th century Denmark. If you don't mind me going ahead and moving on to him.
Absolutely. I'll just preface it by saying that that is your primary area of discipline. He was a philosopher and a very good one, and I'll let you introduce him and talk about him.
And move on. Yeah. Yeah. So 19th century Danish philosopher and theologian. And what really bothered him was, during that time, the Danish state church was really, really prominent. But a nominalism really set in, such that there was this idea that to be Danish was to be Christian. And, to be a Christian in that context was to be Danish. And they're really kind of the two sides of the same coin. So, kind of like to be Italian is to be Catholic, that sort of idea. And he was very concerned about that because he said, um, it's not the state that reconciles you to God. God doesn't have grandchildren in the sense that you become his child by virtue of being part of this group. God only has children. And so he creates us as unique individuals who are called to give an account before him. And so when we think about ourselves as, oh, I'm a Christian because I'm Danish or Scottish or American or whatever, then we live a life of complacency. And we also live a life of kind of apathy, if you will, in asking these more pertinent questions about life and about the self as well. So what he really wanted to do in his authorship was to awaken a kind of earnestness in people. Like, wake up and look at who you are before God. Don't just, oh, I go to church on Sunday because it's just part of my normal routine in life. It's just part of what it means to be in this culture. Because he says if your Christianity fits so comfortably into your normal socio-political existence, then you've actually conflated your Christianity with your nation or with your culture, when in reality, your Christianity should kind of wreck your life. It should change your life radically because you're being called into a different kingdom, essentially. And so if it fits so comfortably, that's probably a really bad sign that it's not actually Christianity. You have a diluted form of Christianity that's really a kind of Christian nationalism.
Mm.
So yeah, his work was very focused on trying to awaken his reader to pay attention to who they are, in relation to God, and what does it mean to live a life coram Deo, under the face of God. What would that possibly mean?
Mm.
So yeah, that's his.
I'm gonna follow up on that. I think it's relevant and fascinating because we as a church are teaching through Revelation just now,
Mhm.
which some would say I'm probably, if you ask my congregants, that I'm woefully unqualified for and should have waited till later in my ministry to give it a go. But I am giving it a go because it's been my most requested book to have a go at because people are so fascinated by it. And
Mhm.
one of the things I'm really up against is a lot of bad interpretations, which I don't mind saying, because Revelation's been subject to so many.
Mhm.
But something that's really coming up, and there's so much there that's almost missing and uncomfortable for our kind of church vocabulary just now. There's a lot of repetition of judgment and the judgment coming. And now I haven't read anywhere near as much Kierkegaard as you have, but I do recognize that as theme, particularly in the likes of Fear and Trembling, that there is a sense to which that brings a different focus to our lives if we see it coming as a reality. And one thing I've been trying to emphasize is that that is something that we are actually all headed towards, and it need not necessarily cause utter panic, because there is safety and even flourishing in Christ.
Right.
But I do wonder if what Kierkegaard was attempting, we have this view of that, what you're describing in the, in Kierkegaard's time in Denmark, the Christian, or what we'd broadly call Christendom in Europe, was prevalent, and it was prevalent in all through the medieval period in a lot of Europe. And we have something quite different today, particularly in the further you travel into evangelical circles, which um, emphasize the need for a very personal relationship with Christ, even to the point of having a very personal encounter, an individual encounter, sometimes to the exclusion of the communal aspect of church. Would you say that without Kierkegaard, you wouldn't have that expression of evangelicalism? Do you think he was hugely influential in redrafting the focus back to the person before God?
Yeah, he was. You see a lot of influence from Moravian pietism in his work. So he was Lutheran, but he also was heavily involved in the Moravian church as well. And so you see that influence of, or that emphasis of moving away from dead religion or religiosity to a vibrant personal relationship with God, something that is authentic and something that is it's a it's an intentional kind of decision as opposed to just something that you're grafted into passively. So you do see that very much in him. Now, I will say that there are a lot of caricatures of Kierkegaard. But one of the caricatures of him is that he is this like hyper individualist, and he has this very privatized view of. Oh, can you hear me? It says my internet.
Yeah,
Can
I
you hear me?
lost you
Okay.
for a couple of seconds there. Your connection might be
Oh,
fluctuating a little. Are
can
you back?
you hear me now?
Yeah, I can now.
Okay, I think I'm back.
Yeah, if you pick up
So
from,
sorry.
no, it's okay. If you just pick up from the caricatures, that would be great. Oh, I've lost you again.
Oh shoot. Let me check my.
Your speed.
It should be fine. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now. It was
Okay.
it was
How about
perfect
now?
up till then.
Yeah, that's weird. It's sometimes odd. Okay, I'll try again. Tell me if I if I go out.
Okay, I will do.
Um, so there are quite a few caricatures of Kierkegaard, and I can explain some of my ideas for why that might be. But one of the caricatures is that he is a hyper individualist, and he has a very privatized view of faith. And they think about texts like Fear and Trembling. Doesn't that somehow suggest a crazy man on the mountain view of faith? Who's killing his son because a divine voice told him to. Um, and so Kierkegaard can oftentimes be associated with irrationalism and with hyper individualism. And I think that neither of them are actually correct. I think in some ways that's an example of bringing your own assumptions to his texts, and reading your certain frameworks, certain modernist frameworks into his texts. Kierkegaard actually does not ascribe at all to a kind of individualism where we are just these isolated monad beings, where it's just I'm complete in and of myself. He actually speaks against that a lot. He thinks we're deeply relationally independent creatures, dependent on God and one another. What he talks about when he references the single individual, he calls out the single individual a lot throughout his corpus, is he's trying to retrieve the distinctive person that God created from being lost in the masses or being lost in the faceless crowd, which we understand is so easy to do, even in our current society, especially with social media. it's easy to just kind of get lost in our identity politics or the crowd that we find ourselves in. And it's sometimes we take comfort in just, oh, I'm with them, or I think what they think, as opposed to really earnestly reflecting ourselves on who we are and who we are in relation to God. So there is definitely a Kierkegaardian influence insofar it's a very pietistic influence in particularly evangelicalism, wanting to emphasize the need for conversion, the need for a personal relationship with Christ. But I think evangelicalism has tended to go to that extreme of this privatized view of faith at the expense of the community. And I actually think Kierkegaard in many ways pushes against that.
Yeah. Sure, and it's not hard to see with these critiques. You and I have lived for parts of the 20th century anyway, and seeing the fact that like a kind of rationalistic approach to things was totalizing would be my experience. And although I think it's encouraging to see something beyond that, and the acknowledgement of more parts to us of being human than just rational creatures is seems to be making a reemergence in a lot of study and thought, which is great.
Mm-hmm.
But what about you? You're obviously very passionate about Kierkegaard. Why don't you tell us how you ended up where you are in terms of wanting to study the man in such depth?
Hmm. Wow. Well, my journey's been it's been long and had different twists and turns. So I'm trying to think of when I very first decided that I wanted to study him. Um, I was trying to decide what I wanted to do my doctoral research on, and I asked one of my PhD supervisors, like, who are some figures that you think deserve more work? And he gave me a long list of people, and somewhere sandwiched in the middle was Soren Kierkegaard. And that name just stuck out to me. And I had read Fear and Trembling in college, but of course it was kind of Kierkegaard just believes faith is irrational, and that kind of engagement with the text. But I had very little knowledge of him, but that stuck out to me. And so I decided to pick up his books and start reading him. And I thankfully had the help of a couple of secondary introductory books, which I always recommend for starting to read Kierkegaard. But I went back to Fear and Trembling, and I reread Fear and Trembling after kind of being given categories from these other books to help me read it. And I found myself actually in tears at a certain point because I was so convicted and also so deeply encouraged by this book. I mean, it just spoke so profoundly to me. I mean, I realized as I was reading, I am a knight of infinite resignation. He talks about the knight of faith versus the knight of infinite resignation. And I just saw so clearly in my life, that is me. And I remember thinking, okay, I'm about to do a very long doctoral program with a lot of research on, but if you're going to pick one person that you're going to research for 3 years at least, you want it to be someone who has that kind of effect on you. I've never read a philosopher who made me cry and go to the Lord in repentance, and then also receive such great encouragement and edification. So that's not something you find often in philosophers. I think it's something that you need to find a lot more of. And I hope to kind of follow that lead in my own work and thinking about the therapeutic benefits of philosophy, not just the ways of using philosophy as a weapon. But to be able to read a philosophical book and you have to put that book down because you have to go talk to God. Like, that's great.
Yeah. Yeah, that's amazing, and thank you for being so honest about that, because I think that's just great to always get a little bit of testimony, and I think refreshing for folks to hear, because it can be even a caricature of those who are involved in advanced theological study in academia in the Christian world, that it's incredibly dry. But I've always found my favorite professors and lecturers when I had to study theology, they were just so enamored with a God that they wanted to study in ever greater depth, that rubbed off, and that made you want to do the same. So I think that's always encouraging for folks, just to see that it comes from the heart as much as the head to study well.
Oh, I mean, it starts with the heart and it has to stay in the heart. The head is very, very important, but your heart is what's going to direct and animate your studies. And so you have to study coming from a place of love. Otherwise, you're going to burn out, and it's also going to turn into a competition or some sort of way of building your own stature. But studying from a place of love, particularly love for God, it's a way of it's yeah, it's a different orientation, and it's also a way of making sure that your studies aren't taking you out of life, they're pushing you deeper into life, which good philosophy should do. We definitely will go into 30,000 feet of abstraction at times, and you have to do that, right? But philosophy should not be about plucking you out of existence. This is Kierkegaard's big point. It should actually drive you deeper into it. It should make you love God and others and live life more fully. It should not make you less human. It should make you more.
Yeah, yeah, it's a powerful refutation of another caricature of the ivory tower, whether it be academic, writer, philosopher, theologian, whatever. And it's really similar, actually. I remember I've had really good ministers over the years have given me that very similar counsel as a minister, that if your study is making you hold up and just reading books all the time, but never
Mm,
seeing people and in relating that to their struggles and lives, then you're kind of not doing it right. And it
right.
sounds like Kierkegaard had kind of cracked that with philosophy
Oh,
all these
yeah.
years ago.
He,
That's,
sh- can you hear me okay?
yeah, yeah, you're great.
He there's one of his texts, it's a pseudonymous text written by Anticlimacus, which I can explain that in just a second, but it's called The Sickness Unto Death. And in the preface of The Sickness Unto Death, Anticlimacus says that what he hopes for this book is that it will be just as rigorous as it is edifying. And he said everything in the Christian life should serve for upbuilding or for edification. And so nothing should be so rigorous that it ceases to be edifying or upbuilding for us as real people in real lives. And rigor actually it should be leveraged in such a way to do that and to help to achieve that. And so he likens the philosopher to a physician at a sickbed, and says, so unlike, a doctor who's in a lab with a lab coat and petri dishes and microscopes in a very sterile, removed environment, he imagines the Christian philosopher and theologian being like the doctor who's at the sickbed, who is very present in the nitty gritty of life, even the difficulties of life, even the sufferings of life, and who is working with the skill of an expert. I mean, this is a doctor, right? But who is working in such a way as to be connected with that person and to be working for their healing. So, you're not removed from suffering, you're not removed from the real world, and the aim of your work is not just to create thought clouds. Right? The aim of your work is to actually bring about healing and growth and flourishing and vitality.
Okay, so um, yeah, it's years since I read The Sickness Unto Death, but that's a very vivid portrayal of it. And so, if I'm hearing you right, and that interpretation of it is that um, philosophy, if you're doing it well, is just a way of kind of coming under Christ's lordship and
Mhm.
applying what he came to the earth to do and to bring in terms of restoring the function of original humanity, and doing that everywhere we see the brokenness around us. Is that fair?
Exactly. Yeah. And philosophy in and of itself, it can't tell you about creation or redemption or sin. It can't tell these are theological categories. These are things we learn from God's revealed word. Philosophy can't discover that on its own, right? You see that even with the Greeks. They got a lot of things right and they learned a lot of things, and they even came to the conclusion that a God must exist. But you can't come to the conclusion that, this God is Trinity, that Christ is God and came as through the incarnation to die on the cross for us. Like, you can't get that by philosophizing. You need to have the revealed word. But what philosophy can do is it can analyze those things. It can help us articulate and kind of taste the textures of those things in really helpful ways to be able to then just see the beauty of them and see ways of understanding their implications more fully.
Yeah, which, it comes back to one of the original points you made, is that God created us with this incredibly well-rounded um, sort of roster of senses and appreciations, and I think Kierkegaard is quite strong on aesthetic appreciation being one of them. So it's like, although we need, like you say, the dogma, the revealed world that tell us, if we just stop there and don't see how that applies to everything God's made, then there's just something less than our entire destiny and flourishing there, isn't there?
Yeah, exactly right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a way that philosophy is the handmaid to theology.
Yeah.
That's a pretty common idea throughout church history. Philosophy isn't necessarily, it can give everything from rational explanations for theological claims, and that's helpful. Um, but it can also help us think about how we live out these truths in robust ways in the world, and I think that's also super helpful as well.
Great. Um, uh, Amber, what do you hope to do? I mean, you're, Lord willing, going to be awarded with that PhD very soon. And what would be your goal? Do you see yourself staying very much in the academic world, or you obviously have a real gift for explaining even philosophy to people who don't know that much about it, like myself. So, what are you hoping to do with those gifts?
Well, I am really excited to be moving to Canada in a couple of months to take this position as assistant professor of philosophy at Redeemer University. So I'll be teaching undergraduate students. I have this first semester, they're giving me a couple of sections of a course called Faith and Philosophy. And so I'm really excited to be looking at just the survey of the relationship between faith and philosophy and how that relationship really became problematized in modernity, and thinking of fruitful ways of being able to relate those two things for us in our present circumstances. I'll be teaching different philosophy courses at Redeemer, which I'm so excited about because I love teaching. I also love research too. Some people tend to like the research more than the teaching. Some people like teaching more than research. I find the two fuel each other. I'm happiest when I'm doing both. So I have the hopes of publishing my dissertation after I defend it. And so thing that will probably take me 6 months or a year to get it ready to be published into a monograph. So I'm hoping that works out. I have a couple of other book projects and research projects in mind in different areas that I want to push my research. I'm really interested in a woman phenomenologist named Edith Stein, who actually is almost unheard of in many ways. She's a saint in the Catholic Church, and she's known for being in that sense, but she's not as well known for being an incredible phenomenologist who got her doctorate under the father of phenomenology and has written amazing books and gave Heidegger a run for his money on Being in Time. I mean, she's really, really, really good, but she had a lot of trouble actually getting philosophy positions, faculty positions, in part because she lived in Germany during World War II, and she was a Jew who converted to Catholicism, but she was born as a Jew. And so before the laws that prohibited Jews from being able to have professions like faculty positions, she also was kind of pushed out of the academy, in part because it was very unheard of to be a woman and to have a philosophy professorship at the time. And then there was some internal politics and some vendetta and some ugly things that happened too. And so, long story short, she actually never got the philosophy professorship that she very much deserved. But she ended up becoming a nun, and she wrote really great books and continued to publish and teach. And so she has really, really good philosophy that very much integrates her faith and philosophy. And she's a Christian woman who thought very intentionally about this world that God created. And so I just think what an amazing model for me personally, as a woman philosopher Christian, But I really would like to expose her more to the world. So she's going to be one of my next on my hit list of my research agenda.
Yeah, you've really sold the idea and the biography. I'm sure even as you're talking about her, I can think of people in my congregation who might be going out to find out a wee bit more about her,
Yeah.
given just the incredible things she achieved.
Well, there are some good biographies about her.
Okay.
And so Edith Stein, you can look her up. There's quite a few. What is lacking is really bringing out her philosophical insight.
Mm,
And that's what I'd really like to do.
okay.
But yeah, definitely learn more about her because she's really encouraging.
Yeah, great. And sort of a heroine for you who has been mingling faith and philosophy and doing so very successfully. So, Amber, I just want to thank you very much for joining us. I've certainly learned a lot. I'm sure anybody who listened has. It's been a real privilege, and we do wish you every success with your PhD and well beyond that. I'm sure you're going to make a very important contribution. So, thank you.
Well, thank you. Thanks for letting me come on. It was great to chat.